Okay, so we are back. Just a reminder, the lunch break will be from 12:20 to 2:30, so about 2 hours. There is nothing arranged here, so you can go around. There are a lot of restaurants around that you can explore. So our next speaker is Pedro Costa. He's coming from Portugal, and he's a self-proclaimed chief over-engineering officer in Subvisual. He will talk about the functional discipline. So Pedro, welcome to Sofia.
Thank you, everyone. Let's start this. Okay. Today I want to tell you guys a story about going functional without actually being using a functional language. So first thing I want to tell you guys, that's where Portugal is. For those that don't know, that's where I come from, and I decided that in order for us to have a smooth talk, I'm gonna have 4 sections, and after each section I'll show you a bit of Portugal, just a little bit, just a teaser. So allow me to introduce the main character of our story, John. John is a web developer, specialized in Ruby on Rails. And John is actually working on a project at the moment where they have to send e-cards over the internet with money. You know, like grandmas do on your birthday, but you put internet on it. Sounds like a great idea, right? Each card has a selected image, and it also has a currency, a selected currency, and a selected value. So your grandma can actually send you dollars, and you can receive them in euros. So one day there's a new task here where the emails actually need to contain an image of the e-card for the receiver. The image will contain a bill of the currency that the sender selected, the value, the name of the receiver himself, the little image that was selected, and this must all be visibly coming out of an envelope. So John is an over-engineer, like many of us, and he actually usually overthinks his solutions. He's known for this in his team, and he knows about it, and he tries to control it. So he tries to start this flow by actually going into the terminal and work things out, because he thinks, okay, I can do this simply with image magic. Let's try it in a terminal. The flow is rather simple. It starts with the image of the bill. It generates an image with a value and positions it on top. Then goes the image of the card. Same thing with a text for the name of the receiver. You place this on the back face of the envelope, and you place the front face on top. Pretty easy, doable with just image magic. John is feeling confident. Now, the thing here is that this is a Ruby on Rails project, and John is a Ruby on Rails developer. And John has been spending over 5 years learning and honing his skills with Ruby on Rails. But when he starts to think about how to implement this, he actually hits an obstacle. And that obstacle is the fact that he has actually started learning a new language. That language being Elixir. Why Elixir? Because Elixir was developed by a Rubyist like him. He saw Elixir, he liked it, and started playing around with it just for fun initially. But as he struggled with the way that a functional language actually works, and when he started to realize there were different ways to solve the problems, when the puzzle started to make sense, he realized that this had actually changed the way he thought about the problems themselves, about the way that he solves the issues. Elixir also has its own web framework, Phoenix, which John also started playing with. It was inspired by Rails in some ways, in other ways it's completely different, but there was this buzz about how faster it was, how more robust the overall application would be. Yeah, it just saw it and thought, maybe this is the future, maybe not. Might be something good to try with a client. Let's trying to get our heads around it. The more John actually worked with both Elixir and Phoenix, the more his reasoning changed. He saw himself thinking more of functional ways to solve problems as a more elegant way. And in this particular case, his instinct was not allowing him to uncover a way to translate that flow of generating that image with objects. Why? Because he now had a new instinct. He was looking at this as a data transformation. He could just pick up the images, generate the text images, pass them around functions that would overlap them with the backgrounds, and then pass them to other functions that would position things and overlap them together, generating the final image. So at this point, John has the problem of, okay, I know a new way of handling this problem. It sounds better to me, and it actually beats any strategy that I can come up with in Ruby. So, as he is an over-engineer, he just throws his caution out in the wind, and let's over-engineer this again. So, the first thing that John actually does is makes the concept of create a very simple set of objects to represent the functions, the transformation points. Those objects only have one purpose. They only represent the transformation. They expose a single method, and they receive in their constructor all the data that they might need to perform that action. This is the equivalent in an object of a closure, for instance. In Rails, we usually call them service objects. For those of you that might know your patterns, it's just a command pattern, but without the undo part. Next, John needed a way to actually chain the steps together, do something useful with them, because the chains are all just a unit. So he created an object that would take a list of these classes, these step classes, and would just run them one by one, sending the result of one as the input for the next one. And it received the input for the first one. Nothing very fancy, just a very simple way to send data across the objects. And as he actually put this in place, he started to realize that the objects that were moving the data around were very simple and had little to no behavior. So he decided to actually enforce this. So none of these objects could have any behavior whatsoever. And since we're actually going towards structures, he decided, let's make this immutable and enforce this ourselves. Okay, stop here. This is a beach in Portugal, Sagres, one of the most beautiful areas for beaches in Portugal, although you get beaches throughout the whole country. Let's just enjoy this while I drink some water, because this was end of first section. Okay, so we saw a very simple way, in a very simple summary of how you can actually bring some concepts of functional languages into a non-functional language. Continuing our story with John, this was still an over-engineering solution, but it actually made sense. It gave him a more elegant way to translate the way he thought about the problem. And given that he actually transformed the object that would go through the function steps to be somewhat immutable, nothing is really immutable, but he tried to enforce this, and they have little behavior, this actually isolated each step from one another. So he was feeling confident about the robustness of the solution. And John, being an over-engineer, he was happy with the solution. He actually thought he had discovered a new and better way to do things even within Ruby. So he started to spread his approach to other problems in the following weeks. He applied these concepts to everything he could. He started moving logic from models, from controllers, from views, all into service objects. But he did this to a point where he even picked up JavaScript. The front end of the project was, for instance, Angular, and he started moving around, and instead of using the typical two-way data binding features, He actually went out of his way to try and make the objects behave like they were not changing anything to the outside. This change to the way they did the JavaScript was the last step in his rampage to make the whole project more functional. But you can see where this is going, right? It was over-engineering everything. And since he was not alone, he didn't have a very happy team with him. His teams were actually in a very facing a very heavy problem right now, because they were facing the challenge of having to keep up with John. His approaches, although they were better in some cases, they were bringing some benefits. They were consistently breaking conventions. The team's conventions, the project's conventions, John was just going berserk, even for the simplest cases. Even worse, his over-engineering vein was at full speed. He started trying to improve his own solution. He started trying to come up with different patterns for the step objects, trying to work out better ways of doing the chaining, even trying to, sharpen the objects that were just moving the data around. Let's stop here for a second. Think about the implications of such a behavior. Okay, this is an exaggeration, of course, but let's think about the implications here. First, it was the conventions. Conventions in a project, in a software project, they work like safety gear in a construction site. Everyone knows they must follow these conventions, otherwise they'll risk bad consequences. One of such consequences would be the time for a developer to actually get on board. Or if we're not talking about a new developer, any developer that is reasonably familiar with a project would take more time to pick up a part that was previously unknown to him. The idea here is that as long as you follow conventions, everyone will work as one in every project. Now, this doesn't mean that every project follows the same conventions. It's typical for projects to have their unique constraints. They have different requirements. And it's not rare for teams to actually explore new stuff and experiment and change conventions. Like you use a linter in one project and you try to use another one in the other. That's perfectly fine, as long as the whole team is following the same set of conventions. So the idea here is that if you change things on your own, if you don't set the rules for the entire project, nobody can follow you. It's mayhem. Getting back to John, the problem here was that he was breaking the project's conventions. But on his mind, he actually had set a new one that his team was failing his team was failing to uphold. He had set a new convention of using a more functional way, and his team was not keeping up. The thing here is that John didn't even document this. There was no breadcrumbs for his team to follow. John just went through his own way. Had he documented this, as he proposed this in any formal way to his peers, he would have discovered that, unlike him, they didn't see this as a holy grail of any sort. They didn't actually agree with this being applicable to every single case. In his mind, he was not even stopping to wonder whether the approach was feasible, or actually if the problem deserved such a solution. He just saw opportunities and went with it, because that's the way he thought the project should go. Now, the second issue here are the experiments that John was actually performing. Since it was not being consistent in any way, he was leaving the little breadcrumbs that he was leaving behind for his team to interpret in his code were very confusing, because each example had slight differences that they didn't know whether they were part of the rules or something that John had just broken for the sake of trying new stuff. And in this case, you can see that having the idea of having a new approach here, the functional approach, is that John actually set a new set of restrictions for himself and for the project. When you think about Ruby, for instance, Ruby doesn't, unless you freeze objects all around, no objects in Ruby are actually immutable. So if you decide that something is going to be immutable, you have to be the one enforcing it. If you decide that you're going to just pass simple objects around, you are the one who has to enforce it. There's nothing in the language that would actually do that for you, unlike using any functional language. So in this case, by being inconsistent, his team has no way of finding out exactly what his intentions were. Now, as every good story, this actually hit a breaking point, the day that John got sick. And the day that John got sick was also the day that a critical bug arose. And you see, when you send e-cards over the internet, you're actually creating transactions. This is a very simple case. You try to send someone money. When that person receives the money, that must be a transaction. Money goes from one place to the other. Now, if you have someone in the team going berserk and changing everything to be functional, but that person gets sick and nobody else knows how to repair the code that is not making the transactions now because of an edge case nobody thought about, yeah, time to panic. Okay, second break. People, this is Lisbon. Some people say it's not that beautiful of a city. I disagree, although it's not the most beautiful. We're getting there. It's known as the city of light. So let's enjoy this for a second. I need a little bit more of water. Just get thirsty. Okay, so first section was about simple ways that you could actually bring functional into your code. Now you see that even if you think that functional is probably the future and is something that we are eventually going to see more on projects, you see that it's not something that you can decide for yourself to actually start doing. It's something you can bring some concepts back to your existing projects, but you can't just start changing stuff without giving the time for your team to actually catch up. Okay, so recapping, John blended the functional approaches into his Ruby code, and he then he started spreading this approach and got to an unacceptable point, to the point where his team was not able to keep up. He was the only person who knew how certain parts of the code actually worked. And in a team, this is unacceptable. This is probably the worst thing that you could do to your team. In a team, everyone is necessary but replaceable. So John had to stop. John had to learn how to control it himself. He had to become more disciplined. And this is the heart of my talk here. You see, discipline is nothing besides the ability for you to control yourself, even if in a difficult situation. It's all about the self-control. It's about you fighting old instincts, breaking old habits, even challenging old conventions, but just enough, not going overboard. And you can become as good as the creator of some language with it, and you can dominate all its bells and whistles, but you don't go around changing everything. You can't simply throw out the old code that's working and rewrite everything. Not in a new language, not in the same language, using a different approach. And discipline is something that's hard. It's inherently hard. It is by definition something we must exert control over. It's not something we do naturally. And it's the littlest things that require us to actually be disciplined. Stuff like doing your bed every morning. Who here makes his bed every morning? Okay, you. So, half a dozen people. Doing the dishes after every single meal. Who here? Yeah, some of you are just lying. Shopping on a budget. Okay, it's not really an option here, but everyone in here must have had the experience of going shopping and having that limited budget, and you just want there's something that you want to buy, that cake, that, I don't know, that game, that PS4 game, something like that, and yeah, you're just on a budget, you can't actually let yourself spend that much money. Prepping, buying, prepping, and cooking the food for an upcoming week. Who here has a busy schedule and actually prepares food on a weekend? Okay, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 hands. So there you go. And just to know the other side, who here struggles with meals during the week, trying not to go to a restaurant? Okay, I must say you guys are actually double of the other ones. The rest of you, yeah, props, you guys can go to the restaurant. Getting up on time, this is a very hard one for me. Getting up on time. Who here struggles with getting up on time? How many times do you hit the snooze button? 5. 5 is a good number. I've gone to 10. So you see, discipline is not something. Discipline is not something that you do naturally. Okay, and one of the things that makes it hard is that it is optional. At the end of the day, discipline is optional. It's not the things that you must do that you struggle with. It's the things that you know you should do, but you really don't have to. It's the things that you don't mind paying the cost of not doing them. You just want the reward that comes with having done them. And there are some options that we take in software projects. You can reinvent the wheel every single time. You can just redo libraries on your own every single time without having to go on Google and actually looking if someone has devised a better solution than the one you thought about. You can be inconsistent. You can try every time you deploy a new solution, you can try new stuff, you can try new flows, new ways. That's something you can do. You can break boundaries, you can just mix responsibilities, have objects that do a bunch of stuff, have God classes. That's something you can do, that we all seen it at some point. We just know we should not do them. Okay, having said this, who here considers themselves to be disciplined? Okay, I have I have 5 hands plus one guy that went like this. So I'm gonna say 5.5, and I'm gonna bet that half of you are liars. So yeah, it's something that's very hard to be disciplined. Now, for those of you that are not, don't feel bad about it. Discipline is something that is actually it's something that you can practice. And if you, for instance, want some books, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Yeah, I always struggle with the name. If, for instance, it describes our brains as having 2 different systems. System 1 operates automatically and quickly. It's based on our instincts, our impressions, our feelings. It gives clues on what we will think about. For instance, it biases your perception of someone in the street by its, for instance, for its looks. The way a person looks will influence how you think about that person. System 2, on the other hand, is the rational part. It allocates attention. It's effortful, but it's the rational part. But it's also slower. Discipline comes from this system, System 2, and its ability to stop System 1 on its tracks. Because when we're in the zone, we're actually devising new solutions. We're inspired, we're doing stuff. This is mostly System 1 at work. But we need System 2 to be disciplined enough to actually put the brakes on it. Think of habit forming, for instance. We can promote the presence of, or the lack of certain habits. But at the end of the day, you need discipline to do a conscious change about yourself. That's what performing a habit is. You change something about yourself. For instance, in The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg talks about a habit being a 3-part process. There's a trigger, there's an action, and there's a reward. Where does the discipline come in here? Discipline is isn't the process It's only something that you need while you build this loop, because this is a loop. If you have a trigger, an action, and a reward, eventually the reward will make it so that the trigger gets easier and you perform the action more times. But when do you need discipline in here? Maybe your reward isn't good enough. It's not good enough that your brain actually registers the habit. Maybe your trigger is not strong enough that it actually triggers the behavior. You don't remember to do the behavior. Or simply, you haven't done the action enough times for that to become automatic. The thing here is that you need discipline to pull out your grit and keep trying. If anyone in this room struggles with trying to become more self-disciplined, I recommend that you guys start small, of course. And for that, I recommend the commencement speech from Admiral William H. McRaven at the University of Texas in Austin. I think this was, 2014, where, amongst other things, he talks about, for instance, what actually making your bed in the morning might mean for your life. And he has this really great quote: if you can't do the little things right, you will never do the big things right. Okay, enough philosophy. Let's stop again. I need more water. This, people, is Porto, the second most beautiful city in Portugal. I highly recommend, if you guys ever go to Portugal, don't go south of this river. It's not worth it. Lisbon is in the south. It's not worth it. Okay, so recapping. Section 1, mixing functional concepts in non-functional languages. Section 2, what can go wrong? Section 3, why you need discipline when you're blending functional concepts in non-functional languages. Now, going back to John, his team, the entire team, not just himself, they all needed to become more disciplined. They all needed discipline as an essential part of the process. First, for John, he had to get a grip on himself. He had to learn to stop and wonder whether the approach actually made sense for the problem at hand. Second, for his team, they actually had to learn the constraints that John had set and enforce them as a group. Because, as I said, if you try to make something immutable in a language that does not actually enforce that, you're on your own. Now, in the weeks that followed, the whole team started to roll back the rampage that John had created. Sometimes because it wasn't actually the best approach for the problem, other times because the problem was actually not worth the trouble of maintaining such a solution. And as the team got a better understanding, they too started using this approach. Carefully, only where it made sense, but the approach spread. Okay? The final part of this story was actually a couple of months after it started, where the same client requested a new feature, something that we all know as one of the symbol use cases for Phoenix, for instance, a chat system. And at this point, they decided not to bring more functional concepts into Ruby, but instead they extracted this very small feature into a microservice in Elixir and in Phoenix. They didn't rewrite the whole bunch of business logic. They just extracted that single feature. Very controlled, carefully planned, just that. And from this point on, the project was actually embracing functional programming in a functional language, without them having to worry in that particular place about the restrictions they had set for themselves. Last break. This, people, is the most beautiful city in Portugal. This is Braga, where I come from. So I'm very proud. Okay, let's sum up. In conclusion, if you take nothing else from my talk, take this. Explore. If you've taken the time to learn a functional language, if you come from a non-functional background and you've taken the time to learn a new functional language, and you too realize that it changed the way you think about the problems, then I encourage you to try and bring some of that concepts back to your existing code. Don't wait until never existing opportunity to actually move projects to functional languages. That might never happen. But if you see advantages in a functional approach, try to bring them to your projects. I've shown you a very small set of ways to do it, but if anyone in here is interested, especially with objects, I highly encourage you to watch this talk by Piotr Solnika at Fullstack Fest 2015. He went to a lot more detail and explained things a lot better than I ever could. And even if Ruby is not your language, I think that's a lesson there for every single one of you. Okay, you can mix stuff, but take caution. Mind the gap between your functional language, your functional concepts, and your non-functional language. Because if you're doing stuff in Elixir, you actually, for instance, if you're doing stuff in Elixir, you actually don't have to worry because you will never be able to do anything mutable. You'll have very function-centric code. Composition will be something that you'll do every day. But if you go to a non-functional language and you want to do stuff like that, you have to enforce it yourself. And don't leave your team behind. Take them with you. Show them the approach, and as a team, learn to ask yourselves when it makes sense and how it makes sense. Because you will all have to enforce this as a team. And especially, don't go too far. It's very funny to start bringing functional concepts into a non-functional language, but it's not always the best approach. In the end, all you need is discipline. Thank you.